New Thought Media Network is proud to present New Thought's Roots and Branches with Reverend Dr. Ruth Miller. Join us every Tuesday at 4 p.m. Mountain Time. Tune in live or watch anytime on our YouTube channel. Discover the rich history of New Thought and its impact on modern spirituality. Join Reverend Dr. Ruth Miller as she shares insights, stories, and teachings that inspire and uplift. Experience deep insights and transformative teachings that connect you to the roots of New Thought. Visit our YouTube channel to catch up on past episodes and join us live every Tuesday at 4 p.m. Connect with us and be part of the journey.
Hello, I'm Ruth Miller, and you're watching New Thought, Roots and Branches. I'm going to be sharing with you over the next several weeks and months the various people, thoughts, and ideas that became what is known as the New Thought movement. This movement is around the world. It's thousands of people. It shows up in a bunch of different places and times. Some of the places you might find New Thought are in Unity publications and churches, or you might find them in centers for spiritual living, or you might find New Thought in a place called Divine Science, or in a sanctuary or home of truth. New Thought is not about a new thought. It's about realizing that our old thoughts are no longer serving us, and now we need to start thinking in a new way. Now, New Thought, as we'll see in the next slide, involves many people over many years of study. I don't expect you to understand everything that's on that slide, but it gives you a sense of how many people have been involved in developing this tradition over the last 100, almost 200 years, since about the 1830s, and before that. And today we're going to look at what is happening before the 1830s. If you look at the next slide, you can get a sense of some of the people that are involved in it in the last, again, almost 200 years, including people in other countries and people working today. And in the next slide, we get a sense of how previous traditions have contributed to what we call New Thought today. And that's what we're going to focus on in today's conversation, presentation, and show. So on the next slide, we're going to look specifically at the specific organizations, thought ways, people that have contributed to this way of thinking. If you look at it, you can see we're talking about ancient traditions through the Christian church, through branching off from the Christian church into the Unitarian movement, and from there we begin to see what is modern New Thought. So if you go on to the next slide, we're going to focus particularly on these traditions. We're going to look at the Zoroastrian, the Hindu, the Brahmanic traditions that include Hinduism and Buddhism. We're going to look at the Judeo-Christian traditions, and we're going to look at the Far Eastern traditions of Taoism and Confucianism. I'm going to start with Zoroastrianism here. The person that we call Zarathustra, or Zoroastro in the Greek tradition, was on the planet, we don't know exactly when, maybe 6,000 years ago, maybe 1,600 years ago, we don't know. But we do know that he and his followers over the thousands of years since have focused on the concept of one God, one beingness showing up in two aspects, the light aspect and the dark aspect. And in that tradition, which became the basis for what is now Parsi or Persian or Iranian traditions, we have the concept of the flame as the symbol for that oneness that is both light and dark, constantly changing, constantly glowing, radiating warmth and light and heat for all beings everywhere. So if you happen to be in that part of the Middle East, you will see temples that are simply flame. They are support for flame, and that's all there is. And that flame is the symbol, the earthly manifestation of an infinite quality that Zoroaster called Ahura Mazda, the Great One. Now, in the Persian tradition, life gets woven into that flame, and that flame informs life. Some people may be aware that at the spring equinox, that time when the sun is equally, for the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere, days are equal day and night for people in either hemisphere. That time, the equinox, is the time of the beginning of a new year in the Persian tradition. And the flame is the means by which they honor that beginning. So lots of candles, lots of fires on the spring equinox in the Persian tradition. So this is where we first see in the history of humanity the one. That doesn't mean that it hasn't been there all along. And you see, I put shamanism in there too. Because long before there was anything like cities or states, there were people who could feel the harmony of the whole. People who knew that all was well when everything was in harmony. People who felt one with all that is. That shamanism, what the anthropologists call shamanism, that way of being that said, we know there is only one, and we have aspect to that, access to that, is a way of being that's fundamental to all indigenous peoples all over the world, and was fundamental long before any cities or states were formed, and has been carried through underground, under the surface, even in the cities and states. That shamanism, that shamanic tradition, is also present in what we call Wicca, or neo-pagan traditions. That is, it was very present throughout the Roman Empire, and the Romans called anyone who didn't live in Rome a pagan, a country person. So a country person knew these fundamental truths, that there is one spirit that motivates all, and that we're all aspects of it, and that a tree is an aspect of the Great Spirit, and the hawk and the rabbit, and all the critters, all the four-leggeds and the two-leggeds, the wingeds, the creepers, the standing, all the beings and the swimmers. Yes, every one is an aspect of the one, and we are too. That's woven into all the shamanic traditions of all the indigenous people. And so when Zoroaster, or Zarathustra, whichever name you call him, was able to say to people in cities, remember, there is only one. And remember that the created environment around you is not representative of that one. He gave them the flame to remember. And the sun is another way to symbolize the one that we are all part of. The sun that gives us all warmth and heat and is the basis for photosynthesis and so much life on this planet is a manifestation of the qualities of the one. And that is the basis for all religious traditions everywhere, all over the planet. So then, all of that is unfolding, and the Caucasians start coming out of the Caucasus, and they are known as Aryans, and the Aryans move across the Middle East. And while some people stay stuck or stay holding on to the Zarathustra traditions, the Zoroastrian traditions, others are brought into the Aryan way of thinking. And that Aryan way of thinking is laid out in great detail in a bunch of texts that are known as the Vedas, and some of them are known as the Upanishads. And that way of thinking became the norm with all of its different aspects of the one. There's still only one in the Vedic tradition, in the Brahmanic tradition, it is Brahman. Brahman is the one, the ground of being. Everything emerges from Brahman. And there are three aspects. There is the Brahman creator face aspect of all that is. And there is also the Shiva aspect, who in the creative process is destroying many things that no longer work, and then is bringing forth new possibilities. Yes. And then, oh my goodness, there's the Vishnu access and accent and facet of the one, the Brahman. And Vishnu is helping us to deepen and know deep inside of us what is true. So Brahman, Vishnu, and all of that wonderful experience of the depth of the one happen in us and around us as we accept the teachings of the Vedas and the Upanishads, which only came into European awareness in the 1800s, except in little tiny bits, which is a very interesting realization that we can work with as we go forward. So this Brahmanic tradition became what we call Hinduism today. And there are many, 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 many ways to practice Hinduism. And out of Hinduism, we get the notion of there are many paths up to the mountain, but all the mountaintops, all those paths lead to that one place, which is the realization in our beingness of Brahman. Now, in the Hindu tradition, my individualized aspect of Brahman is Atman. I am the unique aspect of the whole. My Atman, my essential being, is that. And so in the Hindu tradition, we say Namaste or Namaskar. The Atman that I am recognizes the Atman that you are, and we are both one in Brahman. Yes. And from the Hindu tradition, after thousands of years, came what is sometimes called the flowering of Hinduism in the form of a young prince who had grown up being totally protected from anything like suffering, any possibility of illness or age or any concept of pain was kept from him until he was in his 20s. And he was married and his wife was going to have a baby. But somewhere in the great palace grounds that had been his only environment forever, he heard a song. And in that song was a pining, a longing, a hunger. He had never heard anything like that. He'd never encountered anything like that. And he followed the song and he found a person and he learned that person's story. And it was a longing for where that person had come from. And based on that experience, that young prince, who we know as Gautama, got permission and actually demanded and through the actions of the spirits around him was finally enabled to go out into the world in a great parade. And again, everything that looked like suffering was hidden from him, except, one old crippled man. Gautama saw that and followed him. All this is beautifully told in a marvelous movie called Little Buddha, in which, of all things, Keanu Reeves is playing the prince, Gautama. Anyway, he follows the man and he sees that other side of civilization, where people are working much too hard and old people are left to suffer. And he is heartbroken. Oh, his heart goes out to all these people. Well, his father is not going to allow this to happen. So his guides, his guards, his people drag him back into the palace, and he suffers inside. In the meantime, his wife has a baby, and Gautama is there, being aware of all that suffering out there and aware that he must do something about it. And so after the baby is born and has been presented and all the appropriate rituals have been performed, one night he gets up and everyone in the palace is asleep. And he gets his horse and he rides his horse. And then his best friend Govinda follows him. And the two of them leave the palace, and the gates close behind them. And they ride into the forest, and at the edge of the forest, Gautama gives up being the prince. And he connects with a group of Hindu sannyasin, ascetics, people who wander around in the woods, living on maybe a grain of rice a day, drinking a little bit of dew every day, meditating a lot, and doing without. And he joins them. And the story continues, and I won't give you all the details, but I do suggest you find it if you haven't. There are many versions of it out there. And the man, Gautama, ends up realizing that neither the world of riches nor the world of deprivation will end suffering. There must be a middle way, another way. And he begins to find it. And as he begins to find it, he realizes, how am I ever going to explain this, communicate this, make this clear to other people? And he sits down under a tree, a kind of a tree that today is called the Bodhi tree. Bodhi meaning Buddha in the Hindu tradition, in the Hindi language. So he sits down and he meditates and he meditates. Well, he's learned how to meditate, and it goes on for days. He doesn't need to worry about eating. He's learned how not to eat. And he ends up meditating for the always traditional scriptural period of 40 days and 40 nights. And I figured that out. If you and I are sitting together and we count all our fingers and all of our toes, that adds up to 40. It's more than we can count. So anyway, 40 days and 40 nights under the Bodhi tree. And he comes to terms with all of his own anger and all of his own blocks. And then he becomes aware of all of the temptations of the world. And these are always presented beautifully in the stories. And then he finally gets it, that it's just being it that matters. And he touches the earth. And all of that other past and all of those other ideas just explode around him. And he is the awakened one, the enlightened one, which is what the word Buddha means. So Gautama is now Gautama Buddha. And he gets up from his meditation. And the first people he encounters are the 5 ascetics that he had studied with before, and his friend Govinda. And he proceeds to tell them the points that he had learned. And he does so simply that all the complexity of Hinduism gets boiled down into just a few simple statements, the noble truths of the Buddha. And they become his followers. And they wander, and more people become his followers. And so at about 600 BCE, before the Common Era, Buddhism is established as the flowering of the Hindu tradition in northern India. Over the years to come, it spread and it changed, and different Buddhas emerged with different names. And so if you go to Thailand, you go to the city of the temples in Bangkok, you will see one space that has 1,000 different Buddhas in it. They're all different people who achieved enlightenment. So Buddhists do not worship this man, Gautama. They know that he is the teacher who helps them achieve that spot at the top of the mountain that is the oneness with Brahman. Well, interestingly, about the same time that Buddha is developing and becoming who he is, over in China, there's a group of people who have been studying the shamanic traditions, and in the urban setting, they're realizing that doesn't work. And so they're beginning to formulate a variety of rules and guidelines that were ultimately written down and published in the book of the Tao. The book of the Tao. The Tao means the way things happen, the flow of life, the way the one is unfolding in all things. And so this little book that's been compiled by someone who we think of as perhaps a scribe, but is called Lao Tzu. Lao Tzu means ancient master, ancient master. So Lao Tzu's Book of the Tao becomes a very powerful tool. It's wonderful. It reminds people, don't try to take control. That doesn't work. It reminds people, don't think that you have to be subject to what's going on out there. You don't have to, because you are the one. You are the flow. And all that's happening is flowing together with you and as you. Oh my goodness, yes. And so the Book of the Tao De Jing, becomes a huge part of the emerging civilization of China at about the same time that Buddhism is slowly becoming a part of the emerging civilizations of Southeast Asia and Northern India. Well, soon after Lao Tzu came another master named Confucius, which in English and Latin we say Confucius. And Confucius was going, but there's order. We have to follow order. We have to make sure this is in place and this is in place. And we do the orderly thing and we relate to people in this orderly way. And one of Lao Tzu's students, Chuang-Tzu, another master, comes in, and there's this constant, wonderful interaction between Chuang-Tzu and Confucius. And they're going back and forth, and there's all kinds of stories that you can follow on that. There are paintings, and there are all kinds of things. You can find them. Look up Chuang-Tzu or Chuang-Tzu and Confucius or any of that on the internet, and you'll find marvelous, marvelous stories. So we get that flow, that harmonious flow that is all that is. So in China, it's not about climbing up a path to the mountain. It's about allowing what is in an orderly fashion, the way Confucius wants it, or in a free-flowing fashion, the way Lao Tzu lays it out in the Tao De Jing. Both of these are happening at the same time, Buddhism and the Far Eastern philosophies. In the Persian world, the Zend Avesta is being written to take the principles that Zoroaster had established long before and put them into place. Another piece of the puzzle that comes in much later is before Buddha, after the Vedas, in India, and that's Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, in which he says, if you follow a specific pattern of breathing and sitting and focusing your attention, you can develop all kinds of abilities to heal yourself and to heal other beings on the planet. I'm going to adjust a little bit so I'm not going off the edge. There we go. So as we look at that, we have a variety of texts coming into the United States somewhere about the middle 1800s, and they will all inform the New Thought movement. Interestingly, the Silk Road between China, India, the Middle East, and Rome was well in place by 300 BC. In fact, some people say as early as 500 BC, shortly after the Buddha was on the planet. And so an emperor in southern India, the Emperor of Kerala, sent Buddhist monks along the Silk Road to discover what was out there and to share the Enlightenment. And we have evidence that the ancient Greeks were receiving input from the Buddhists as early as 400 BC and 300 BC. So those Greek scholars were not operating in isolation. And they made a huge difference in the thinking of what became the Judeo-Christian tradition. And that's the huge foundation on which most of New Thought is based, because almost everyone in the 1800s in Europe and the Americas were deeply steeped in the Christian tradition and in the Judeo tradition as presented by the Christian Old Testament. So we start seeing many, many, many more inputs from these ancient sources through the Greeks into the Christian tradition. So if we look at the next slide, we begin to see what some of those are in specific people. This is a tree that I'm going to suggest gets expanded to fill the screen if possible, so that you can see way back early on, we've got the Buddha and the Hindu and all of that. We start getting, and there's the goddess tradition, which is, growing out of shamanism. We begin to see with Plato the influence of these traditions, and then through Plato, into Sophocles and the Sophists. The Sophists were a group of people who went around saying, you need to be wise like a fox, to quote a certain New Testament speaker. You need to be open to what is and bring infinite wisdom to what is so that you can experience it fully. The Sophists, many philosophers say that what Jesus was teaching, Jesus of Nazareth from the New Testament, was teaching the Sophist tradition that had been developed by the ancient Greeks. Now, if we go on, of course, Jesus influenced a man called Saul of Tarsus, who became Paul. And Paul was the one who wrote most of what we call the New Testament today, and is the primary marketing agent, if you will. There's an author, Augmandino, who called Paul the greatest salesman in the world. Wrote a book about it, as a matter of fact. So Saul is the one who took these fundamental sophist ideas, which he grew up with. He was a Greek who happened to be Jewish. And the inspiration that he had in the revelation of experiencing in the light the resurrected Jesus speaking to him. Saul never met Jesus as a human being. Only that light-filled Holy Spirit experience of resurrection. Oh my good Saul, why are you persecuting me? Why are you persecuting me? Oh dear, dear, dear. And it woke him up, and he was blinded for several days, brought into full sight by people who were Christian in their tradition, and began to then teach. And he developed that early Roman church that began to spread throughout the Roman Empire. And in the early 300s, when Constantine became the emperor of Rome, he called them all together and he said, look, Rome is no longer what it was. We are no longer able to require everyone to obey the law of worshiping our gods and our emperor. We're going to replace that with Christianity. So he went and did that, replacing the idea of what could be Roman only with the idea of this dead and resurrected carpenter from this odd little place called Palestine in those days, and turned it into the global Roman universal, which is what Catholic means, the Roman Universal Church. Well, in the early stages of the Universal Church, there was no universality. There were a lot of different perspectives, and Origen is one of them. Origen, if you want to pronounce it that way, was one of those folks. And he had his ideas about how that spirit that Jesus embodied could be in each of us. Paul talked about that and encouraged that, and Origen provided some techniques and ways of doing that. And then Plotinus comes along and he says, in some interesting ways, what we're talking about is the same thing Plato had been talking about. Now I'm going to remind you what Plato talked about. Plato was a man who saw that what we see around us, this stuff, is never perfect. It is what he saw as the temporary manifestation of an ideal form that is eternal and perfect. Each human body is the temporary manifestation of an ideal body that is eternal and perfect. Plotinus brought those ideas into Christianity and said there was the potential for experiencing ourselves in our perfection in that ideal world, in that ideal realm, if you will. So Plotinus and Plato laid out a concept that is now called Neoplatonism, and this is another fundamental piece of the New Thought movement, that what is real is not what we see, But what is real is eternal and perfect, and what we see is changeable. That happens to go back very well into the Hindu tradition that says that matter, what we see, what we sense with our senses, is changeable. Maya in its root form means changeable or plastic. Maya does not mean illusion. Okay, it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It means that it's changing all the time. And that which can change instantly. It's not permanent in its form. So that concept of Maya through Plato, through Plotinus, ends up as a huge part of what is now the New Thought movement. So as we go forward then, we're going into the Middle Ages. So that was pre-Roman Church. Then we get the Roman Church, and along about 1000 AD, late 900s, and AD being Anno Domino, which is the Latin for the year of our Lord, which is now said CE, Common Era, which interestingly also translates as Christian Era, but we won't have to go into that with great depth. Anyway, we start seeing along about 900 to 1000, the emergence of a merging of the ancient Greek and the then Catholic traditions, the then Roman traditions. The reason for that is that Arabs, Muslims, who had been merging the ancient Judeo tradition with the ancient Arabic and the Zoroastrian traditions through what we call the Quran today, were now spreading across the Mediterranean, and southern colonies or southern provinces of the Roman Empire were pretty much dominated by Arabs, and there had been a diaspora after Jesus. So there were Jews spread throughout the Roman era, particularly around the Mediterranean people, because Mediterranean climate was familiar. So why would they go up into cold climate when they know the Mediterranean climate, right? So there's Jews all over the Mediterranean. And in the area that we now know as Spain, the Jews, the Christians, and the Arabs were all doing quite well together, kind of like Palestine before World War I. So all kinds of people are doing very well together, and people are learning from each other. And there is a monk named Fulbertus, and he has learned that there are ways to understand what the Christian teachings are that we can gather from the Judeo tradition and from the ancient Greek tradition. Now, he is a politically astute man, and he encourages and makes it possible for one of his very good friends to become Pope. And then he gets permission from his Pope, Innocent, to build a school in France. And that school is called Chartres, Chartres, which means stones. A stone dolmen actually means a pile of stones, a Chartres. And their symbol is a dolmen. And they were located on a bluff under which was a spring. And that spring was dedicated to the goddess. And then Julius Caesar had seen it and written and created a shrine there. And then the Romans created a shrine there. And then Fulbertus went and he created a structure there that ultimately became what is now the Cathedral of Chartres. And you can go in that cathedral down into the part of the building that Fulbertus built. Now, what he was doing was integrating the Platonic understandings of the Greek traditions with the mystery schools that were from the goddess traditions and the Roman tradition. So he mixed all of those together and created a special Christian mystery school, which became the academic center of the Roman world, all of Europe into parts of the Mediterranean for several hundred years, almost 300 years, prior to Thomas Aquinas. So his mystical approach to Christianity got woven in at this point. And you can see as we go down, now we get Servetus, who also grew up in the Alhambra region and studied the Bible, and he began to realize it doesn't say anything about three in one. There is only one God, and that God is the Father God, the Creator God. And by that point, the Roman Church was getting to the point of burning people who said things they weren't saying. So he ran off in much later, we're talking 1400 here, late 1400s to 1500s, Servetus ran off to Geneva, hoping that Martin Luther's Reformation would protect him. But no, the guy who was in charge in Geneva at that time, and the group of people who were running things, said, no, that's heresy. It's a Trinity. It's not a Unitarian God. Servetus had established Unitarianism. That was carried to England, and a man named Theodore Lindsay, which happens to be in my family lineage, which is kind of fun, created the Unitarian movement in England. One guy, all right? At the same time, we have happening, again, out of the Alhambra tradition, where it was cradled, but it had been around since Jesus' time, a concept of universalism. This means in the Christian tradition, you can follow the teachings of Jesus. You can believe in God the Father. You can accept the presence of the Holy Spirit, and you will never go to hell, because a loving Father would never send his beloved children to hell. And this is the essence of universalism, and we'll talk more about that as we get further on. All right, so here we go. Now we've got all these things beginning to make sense. And if you could make this chart be the full screen again, I'd appreciate it. All right, so you begin to see we've got the Unitarians happening off to one side. Down the center, we've got Martin Luther, we've got John Wycliffe and Francis Bacon, and that version of the Bible we call the St. James Bible, and the whole creation of the Anglican Church in the 1600s. Yes, and Shakespeare. Some people say, and there's a lot of support for it, that Francis Bacon and William Shakespeare are the same being, and their language becomes the language that is the basis for all spiritual literature in the Western English tradition for the next several hundred years. So we have the Catholic tradition, the Roman tradition, we have the overall Protestant tradition, we have the specific Protestant tradition of the Anglicans, and then a totally different Protestant tradition that says, no, not Trinity, unity. And that all combines to provide the foundation on which some Americans in the middle 1800s began to lay out the philosophy that William James, the philosopher of religions, called the philosophy of prosperity and happiness, positiveness, he said. So when we look at all of those together, we're realizing that there isn't any one new thought here, is there? We're talking about thousands of years of thinking. We're talking about merging together people from many, many, many different eras and epochs. And some of our teachers have understood that over the years, and some of them haven't. And so as I go forward over the next several weeks and months, we're going to be talking about individual teachers, and some of them are going to refer back to some of the things we talked about today, and some of them won't. Some of them will be looking at deriving it from their current culture, not realizing how far back their current culture is depending on to give them the materials that they're using. And that's cool. And probably, if you've been in the New Thought movement, that's exactly what you've been experiencing. It looks like this is all coming at you brand new, but it isn't. Couldn't be. Humanity always builds on previous generations. It's how we are. Now, I invite you to stop for a moment and be aware that you are part of a lineage that goes back into ancient times. Times when the only thing people experienced at night was starlight, moonlight, and the flame. Times when that light, those sources of light, were shifting and changing, but the darkness remained constant. What was that about? Allow yourself to go back in your awareness, in your imagination, to a time when there were lots of people around, each in their own unique space. And they were each trying to find their own way in the darkness and in the light. And imagine that you would come together at different times of the year. You'd come together and you'd realize, wait a minute, we're not isolated. We share this journey. And you would share the journey. You would go to a mountain. You would go to a cave. You'd go to a large tree in a clearing. And you would gather and you would sing about what you were experiencing. And sometimes you'd sing together and harmonies would come out of that. And those harmonies would lift you to a higher state, because that's what harmonies do. And there would be fire or not. There might be torches, there might be a bonfire, or it might be earlier in the evening when it's dusk, when there is no sun, no moon, no stars, just this light that is everywhere present. And in those times and in those awarenesses, people have the same questions we have. People had the same wonderings we have. People had the same explorations. What if that we have? And it's those that became the ideas, that became the, not just ideas, but the concepts and the doctrines and the statements written in all of these spiritual traditions. And those are our heritage in the New Thought movement, our heritage in this culture, because a lot of those ideas have been spread throughout the culture. This culture we call America, and this culture that we call the global economic Western culture that has kind of taken over everything. It's everywhere present. The idea is that there is some power greater than us. And that power that is greater than us is making things happen we could never have happen. And that power is accessible if we can just allow ourselves and teach ourselves the way to experience it. In the indigenous peoples, these teachings are part of everyday life from day one. Every infant is taught how to be in harmony with and how to develop power with. In cultures like ours, city-states, we're not taught that. Because in these cultures, the idea is that there is some person in charge, and that person has access to power, and we don't. That culture is just about done. It's only been on the planet for about 6,000 years. It's just about done. And part of how it is crumbling around us, and part of how we can thrive as it crumbles around us, is those of us who are focused on the unity of the Brahman, the ground of being that is everywhere present, in us, through us, as us, working with us, for us, and as us as well, for the good of each of us and the good of everyone everywhere, for that is its nature. And all of these people, over all of these thousands of years, have come to that place of feeling that and knowing that. And that is what the Hindus call being enlightened, being aware, being awake, being Buddha, being one with what Paul called the mind that was in Jesus Christ, the one mind that is all that is, creating constantly in us and through us. That's what these teachers have been telling us. They've gone off the edges, they've come back to the center, they've explored possibilities, and then they've shared what they've come to understand. And that's what all the teachers we're going to study in this series will be doing with us and for us. We'll be talking about the original four, those 3 or 4 people who were getting the ideas on out into the world, and then their students and their students and their students and their students, all the way up to the modern last 20 to 30 years. And I'm looking forward to doing it with you. And I'm looking forward to hearing from you as well. My personal website is ruthlmillerphd.com, and I am the president of the Emerson Institute. emersoninstitute.edu. You can reach me through either of those places, and we can explore more as we move forward in this world that seems to be falling apart around us, but can't be, because there is only one presence, one power, one love and life moving in and through us and everyone around us, because that is the truth of our being. And that is why we can say in truth and with great integrity and appreciation, Namaste.